and welcome everybody to this webinar today. My name is David Merwin. I'm an investment officer with the Investment Manager Engagement Programs at CalPERS. Thank you for joining us for the Transition Manager Solicitation webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to provide information on the solicitation and its purpose. Today I'm joined by CalPERS team members Harshal Shah of Private Equity and Ron Chavez of Global Equity. They will answer any questions of their respective asset classes. We are saving plenty of time at the end of this webinar to answer your questions. However, we urge you to send in your questions via the chat box during the webinar, so we have them in hand as we begin the Q&A session. Before I begin to outline the Transition Manager Program, I want to share some information about my program area and the Emerging and Transition Manager programs at CalPERS. Investment Manager Engagement Programs, known as IMAP, provides total fund coordination across all asset classes in the areas of Emerging and Transition Manager Programs, External Manager Monitoring and Evaluation, Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives, California Investment Initiatives, and Labor Relations. Today we are talking about the Emerging and Transition Manager Programs. CalPERS has a legacy of leadership and innovation in emerging investment strategies. We've been investing directly with emerging managers for more than 25 years. We remain committed to engaging with our stakeholder community. We want to strengthen relationships with our emerging managers and improve implementation of emerging manager investment strategies. Through our work with emerging managers, we discovered a gap between emerging managers and established managers, and this has led us to our Transition Manager Program. The Transition Manager Program was started in June of 2015. We surveyed many of our pension peers, external managers, and other stakeholder groups to gather information on their past experience with emerging and transition manager programs. What we found out was there was no path for emerging managers to become established managers at CalPERS. The Transition Manager Program was designed to provide a path of growth for successful early-stage managers who no longer fit the parameters of an emerging manager. We have three objectives for this program. We first and foremost want to generate appropriate risk-adjusted returns, and when we make an investment decision, it always needs to meet a strategic investment need. We want to have access to and have investment opportunities with the most successful firms available to us. And of course, we want to provide a path for emerging managers to compete for entry into our pool of larger established managers. Some important highlights of our Transition Manager Program are new commitments to transition managers over the next 5 years. We have 3 participating asset classes: global equity, private equity, and real estate. However, as I'll mention later, only global equity and private equity are participating in this specific solicitation. We have up to 5 managers that will be selected per participating asset class, and this is important. We will conduct transition manager solicitations not only in this year in 2017, but also in 2019. We are doing 2 solicitations in this time frame to find the best transition managers we can. And remember, you can at any time submit an investment proposal to CalPERS via our online portal. This is especially true for the private asset classes, as their fundraising may not coincide with our solicitations. The Transition Manager Program has specific criteria for each asset class. However, each new transition manager will be a direct relationship with CalPERS staff. This is not a fund-to-funds model. Private equity is looking for buyout and growth strategies with fundraisers at a minimum of $1 billion. We are looking for private equity managers raising their 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th institutional fund with more than $1 billion in assets under management. And let me just back up a second. I jumped one slide. We are actually on global equity. So for global equity, we're looking for publicly traded equity securities. The managers will need to have assets under management of $2 billion to $15 billion. Managers should have a minimum of a 3-year life track record, and we're looking for regional and U.S. strategies only with no niche focuses or frontier markets. But we will consider emerging markets as part of a global strategy. Qualifying managers can expect commitments of approximately $500 million in global equity. Now for private equity, they're looking for buyout and growth strategies with fundraisers at a minimum of $1 billion. We're looking for private equity managers raising their 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 6th institutional fund with more than $1 billion in assets under management. The managers should have a domestic investment focus, and we are avoiding debt and venture capital strategies in private equity. Managers, if chosen in private equity, can expect a minimum commitment of approximately $100 million and follow-on commitments if the funds perform and there continues to be a strategic fit for CalPERS. As for real estate, as I mentioned earlier, I know there was a lot of publicity about this asset class participating in this solicitation. However, the Real Assets Unit is currently assessing portfolio needs in tandem with developing the appropriate scope and criteria for its Transition Manager program. Real Assets is committed to the Transition Manager program and providing a path of growth and opportunity to its early stage managers. Real Assets anticipates releasing its Transition Manager solicitation in the future, but will not participate in the private equity and global equity Transition Manager solicitation this year in 2017. Real Assets remains committed to the pacing and deployment of new capital of up to $2 billion and selection of up to 5 transition managers over a 5-year period. Once submissions come in and they pass the minimum qualifications set forth by each asset class, they will be evaluated by a set of general evaluation criteria, which includes portfolio fit, strategy and value creation, management team and talent, alignment of interests, and historical performance. This is very important. This is the Transition Manager Solicitation Timeline, and it's very specific. The Transition Manager Solicitation will be released on July 11th, 2017. You will have up to July 25th, 2017 at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time to submit questions to CalPERS regarding this solicitation. That is a hard deadline though, July 25th at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. On August 25th, 2017, CalPERS will respond to all the manager questions. We'll post the questions and the answers on the website. And then coming up are the final filing dates for these solicitations. For global equity, it's August 29th at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And this is important. For private equity, it's August 31st at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. So let me repeat this. Global equity, August 29th at 3 p.m. For private equity, August 31st at 3 p.m. This will all be spelled out in the specific asset class solicitation. Please adhere to the CalPERS restricted contact policy once the solicitation is released. The policy prohibits CalPERS staff and any party financially interested in the contract or any officer or employee of the interested party from engaging in communication concerning any matter relating to the solicitation or contract per California Government Code 20153. If you do have questions once the solicitation is released, you may submit email questions to CalPERS via the email address calpers_investment_proposals@calpers.ca.gov. As mentioned before, you will have until July 25th at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time to submit your questions. Investment staff will review all the questions and post questions and answers to the CalPERS website on August 25th, 2017. This may be the most important slide of the entire presentation. All proposals must be submitted through the Investment Proposal Submission, also known as IPS, portal. The address of the portal, as you can see here, is www.calpers.ca.gov/investment proposals, which is one word. This is the only way to submit a proposal to CalPERS. Let me reiterate, this is the only way to submit a proposal to CalPERS. Gone are the days of sending in hard copy responses. Everything must be submitted through the IPS portal. You also can be kept up to date on the solicitation and other CalPERS investment news by signing up to be contacted via email at www.calpers.ca.gov/investment office news, all one word. Here you can sign up for solicitation information and updates, as well as investment news and events. Here is some information we think may be helpful to you before we get to the open question portion of the webinar. What if I am not fundraising during your solicitation? Irrespective of our solicitation, CalPERS will always review and consider opportunities that are submitted through the IPS portal. Who can I talk to about the solicitation? Once solicitation is open on July 11th, there is a no contact period. However, questions may be submitted to CalPERS until July 25th at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Prior to the launch, you may email us at infoimapgroup, all one word, at calpers.ca.gov with questions, and we'll show you that email address later in the presentation. Is CalPERS required to select transition managers through this solicitation process? No. CalPERS will only select managers that fit the needs of CalPERS and its investment classes. If no managers are found through this solicitation, we will continue to consider opportunities through the IPS. What if I do not meet your MQs? Simply said, if you do not meet the MQs, your submission will be rejected. Is this the only solicitation for transition managers? No. CalPERS will conduct another solicitation for transition managers in 2019. That concludes the presentation portion of this webinar. We'll now begin answering your questions in the open Q&A segment, and we'll leave this slide up there to remind you of the specific timelines regarding the solicitation. So we have a question comes in that says, does the term transition manager have nothing to do with transition management? Well, simply said, no. Our definition of a transition manager, as was mentioned during this webinar, are specific to the asset classes. We're not looking for any transition management. These are managers that are transitioning from being an emerging manager to an established manager. So I would encourage anyone, if you have any other questions, to please feel free to submit them through the chat box on the webinar site. But it looks like we do not have any other further questions. This webinar will be posted to the CalPERS website in the next few days, and there should be a link to download the presentation that we went through today for the webinar. We want to thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar. We've hoped you've gained a more thorough understanding of the upcoming CalPERS Transition Manager solicitation. Should you have any additional questions, or if your questions weren't answered for some reason, please reach out to us at infoimapgroup, all one word, at calpers.ca.gov. And as I promised, we do have that email address up there. Once again, it's infoimapgroup, all one word, at calpers.ca.gov. Once again, as we've talked about a lot of email addresses and websites, but if you were able to download this presentation, all that information will be there. So there shouldn't be any question about who to email or when to email or who to contact. So the question is, how long does it take to finalize manager selection, and when do you conclude the process? Well, that's a very good question. If you go on to open up and look at the solicitation when they become available on July 11th, you will see a timeline. We have hard dates that take you through the timelines that we've put forth today. The other dates, as far as evaluating managers, evaluating proposals, are on a more flexible time depending on how many managers come in to the process for each asset class. I would expect, and by the way, all winners of any solicitation will be posted to our website, but I would expect finalists to be announced somewhere in Q1 or Q2 of next year. But once again, we're being flexible with those times just because of the time it takes to evaluate, depending on the number of proposals that come in. But my guess would be somewhere in Q1 or Q2 of next year. And it looks like we do have one additional question coming in, so if you're still on with the webinar, we'll ask you for your patience to hold on as we get this question submitted in. And we do really appreciate you folks taking the time to join us on this webinar today. And I'm reviewing the webinar here. So we've got a question regarding kind of the GE qualifications. So they're really talking about managing 400 million, but the firm has more than 2 billion. Would they meet the transition manager description? So I can hand this over to Ron Chavez from our global equity team, and he can hopefully answer this for you.
Sure. So our requirement on asset size for the firm is 2 to 15 billion. So being that they're more than 2 billion, they would meet that criteria. And it sounds like since they started in 2013, they'd have the requisite length of historical track record. So this would be a fine submission.
Great. Thank you, Ron. And we are getting in some more questions now. So once again, it looks like one for the global equity team. You mentioned a 3-year track record. Is that for the firm or for the product we are offering? This is for global equity. Ron?
Great. Thanks for the question. That's related to the strategy that's being offered in the submission.
So once again, it's the strategy, not the firm length, but the strategy for that offering. Thank you, Ron. And we have another question coming in. We appreciate you folks taking the time to submit questions because this is helpful to everyone that's here listening to the webinar today. And questions coming up. And the question is, can you state the difference between an emerging manager and a transition manager? When will an emerging manager become a transition manager? That's a good question. As you look back to the qualifications for emerging managers, like in private equity, for instance, if you're a first, second time fund manager managing, well, actually, maybe I can turn it over to Harshal Shah of Private Equity. He can talk about the qualifications of their emerging manager program.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. So for an emerging manager within private equity, we're defining an emerging manager as someone who's either managing their first fund or second fund, so a team coming together for the first time and executing that specific strategy and managing that strategy over the first 2 funds. Once they start raising their third fund, they become what we call the transition manager. So as long as they're within the 3rd through 6th institutional fund, we'll consider them a transition manager. And as Dave mentioned, this is to effectively seek up-and-coming managers, which we could then place into our established core portfolio.
Great. Thank you, Herschel. Now I'll flip it over to Ron with Global Equity to talk about kind of what qualifies for an emerging manager there.
Sure. So in global equity space, we consider managers with less than 2 billion in assets under management to be in the emerging manager space. But what I'd also say is within global equity, we have partnerships with 5 different advisor firms, and we work with those partners to find managers for that emerging manager program. So folks who would be interested in joining the emerging manager program would reach out to those 5 advisors and would not be submitting through this IPS proposal system.
Great, thank you, Ron. Another question came in of how many GE managers in your emerging manager program are eligible to graduate or apply to the transition manager program.
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I'd say we reconstructed our emerging manager program about 2 years ago. So I think most of the firms within that program as it stands today are probably still at or below $2 billion in assets under management. So I don't know that there's many that would be able to submit for the move into the transition manager bucket at this time.
And let me add there also, just to make sure this is clear, you do not have to be an existing CalPERS emerging manager to apply to be a transition manager for CalPERS. We do not have specific graduation processes in our asset classes. It's based on the performance and the strategy and the need of CalPERS to choose a transition manager. So just want to make that clear. You do not have to manage money now to be a transition manager for CalPERS. It's open to everyone. And we have another question here. Will only finalists in the solicitation process be invited to emerging and transition manager day, or is this a separate process? This is a separate process. The solicitation is not linked to the emerging and transition manager day at CalPERS. That is for a different crowd. You could be somebody that's applying to the solicitation and also attending that day, but they are not dependent on each other. And it looks like we still have some questions coming in, so I'll ask everybody to be patient with us as we get those questions in. And this is a global equity question. Will the 5 advisor firms that have involvement in the transition program or transition, will they have involvement in the transition manager program?
We do rely on those advisors for advice. So, we have interacted with them and they've provided some feedback, but they don't have a formal link to the IPS system or the process as it moves beyond proposal submission.
Very good. Because I think there are quite a few people in our global equity, or familiar with global equity, that we do have managers that work with us on the emerging manager program there, but once again, they're not part of the official process. And I'll just say that all the transition manager submissions will be evaluated by staff. We're not looking for outside consultants to help us. This is done internally. Another question for global equity. Are there any targets for the number of GE transition managers in 2017 or 2019?
There are not. As was mentioned in the slideshow, we will take up to 5 strategies to add to the program. But to the point also made earlier, we're really looking for a good strategic fit. So if that's 1 or if that's 5, we will engage with as many firms as makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Ron. Well, that looks like that's it for the questions. Once again, I do want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar today. Hopefully you have all the information that you need, but once again, if you do have additional questions, you can always send them via email to the email address that were mentioned. So that does conclude our webinar. We thank you, and we hope you have a nice day.